hearing me, and let's go. Let's do it. I'm Amelia Ryback. Very nice to meet everyone, and I will be talking about key behavioral concepts that every UXer should know. So I will dive right in here. Awesome. Great. So I think this is something that everybody here can probably relate to. Have you ever worked on a product, a service, an experience that had quote unquote good UX or usability, but it wasn't actually driving the desired health related or not user behaviors? I can't see the chat, but go ahead, put in the chat if this is something that has happened to you, is currently happening to you. I've been on teams where this has been happening for years on a certain product. Yeah, where we're doing all the right things to have good UX, usable functional products, but in the end, the behavior that we want, especially when it's health related, is not actually occurring. Hopefully, people are just putting the chat there if that's something that everybody here. Basically, if all of us are in the field of healthcare UX, I would bet a good amount of money that this is something that has happened to most, if not all of us, or is something that we are currently struggling with on the teams that we're on today. So basically, I think the field of UX, we've gotten very, very good at making digital products and services that have good usability, they're functional, they have beautiful interfaces and, impressive aesthetics. All of that we do very well, and that's all well and good, but the main problem that I see in the field of UX is that I think as a field, we are too often failing at actually driving behavior, right? No app, no product, no service, no website is useful, truly useful, if it doesn't actually drive health outcomes and business outcomes, both for our users and for the business. And I've seen plenty of flows and features that are by the definition of good UX or usability, they're great, they're beautiful, but they aren't driving behavior. And this is something I think we really need to solve. So I did a quick Google of the different diagrams out there explaining UX, what is UX design, what is UX strategy. We see a lot of these different diagrams. These will not be new to you, right? You need your UX design to be feasible, profitable, and desirable. I don't see behavior mentioned anywhere here. Same thing here, there's these vague terms about it's a science and psychology and art, but actual behavior is not mentioned here. Then the visuals will start to get more colorful and more complex as we go, right? All the different skill sets or the different subjects that you need when you're talking about the field of UX design. Some very complicated visuals we have here. Purposely, you can't read all the little font here because the point of this slide is that I'm frustrated when I Google this and none of these visuals talking about the skills that you need or the subjects or the disciplines that are involved talk about behavior design or behavioral science, anything around behavior. And that's a serious problem to me. And I think that's part of the reason why behavior design is not a skill set that all UXers have. And I think they all need to. So the main point is if we actually, in the healthcare UX space, if we want to be driving real health outcomes for users, good UX or usability or beautiful interfaces are just not enough. We need behavior design. And I think a lot of people are familiar vaguely with behavior design, but not a lot of teams and clients I work with and all kinds of multidisciplinary people really understand how to apply behavior design. So that's what we are talking about today. So what exactly is behavior design? Basically, it's a systematic approach for applying insights from behavioral science to actually drive human or user behavior. It's just applying behavioral science to design, basically. And when I say behavioral science, I'm talking about the academic field of behavioral science and scientific studies from the last many, many decades on principles of what actually works to drive human behavior. So, moral of the story here, when we say behavior design, put simply, it's just designing for behavior change rather than usability, rather than a good user experience. It's actually a whole design process that revolves around behavior at the core, at the center of it. Again, like I said, I haven't found any good diagrams that I'm happy with, but this is one of the ones that I think comes closest. It's from a 2022 paper, and basically they're talking about kind of the difference between design thinking versus behavioral design. All of us are familiar, I think, with design thinking. This is nothing new here when it comes to an agile user centered design process, right? We empathize with the user, we understand the problem space, then we define it better and define what the requirements are. We ideate, we prototype something, and continuously prototype test until we have a final product. Behavioral design is very much almost the same thing, but it puts behavior at the center. So you're understanding what are the actual behavioral problems at play. What is the target behavior that you're trying to drive? And you diagnose what are the friction points or what are the barriers to that behavior. Then you identify what are the BCTs or the behavior change techniques that you need to be implementing to drive that behavior. And then you can translate that for digital products into features, that actually intervene and create that behavior change. And then you test it to see if it actually brings the outcomes that you want. So as you can see, the steps are pretty much exactly the same. The main thing here is that behavior is at the core. So what they call it whatever you want, behavior design thinking, doesn't really matter. But the idea here is our user-centered design process is very ripe for putting this element of behavioral science into it so that we can actually drive behavior. So all the steps are the same. You empathize with the users, you understand what behavior they're actually trying to drive or change. Then you translate that into what are the requirements to be able to change that behavior? What is that going to look like? Then you ideate, prototype, and test whatever solutions that are actually going to drive that behavior. And again, like I said, in healthcare, this is so key. Maybe other apps can get away with just good UX and really pretty visuals, but in healthcare, we all need to be behavior designers, not just UXers. So, key concept, like I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some of the key concepts. This is inspired by my experience working with different teams, UXers, researchers, designers, product managers, data scientists, and my client work as well. And these are kind of inspired by the top mistakes that I see people making, even great UX designers who are not really trained in behavior design. These concepts are geared towards fixing those mistakes. So this will sound very simple. This is not going to be rocket science here, but the first thing, the mistake I see people make, and I want every UX team to understand, is that before you start the design process, you need to get clear on the target user behavior that you're trying to drive. So obviously, this might seem pretty obvious on the surface, but most people talk about behavior as just actions. And behavior is not just an action. You have to get very specific when you define behavior. So, what do I mean by that? What exactly is a target behavior, a clear target behavior? You define who's doing it, so the user in our case, doing an action, a very specific, concrete action in a particular context at a specific time. So I think most of us are very good at the first part. We understand our users very well. I hope we all do if we're on this talk, on this call, in this conference around UX. We understand our users. We do a lot of research to understand them and the actions that they are doing and the actions we want them to do in our app. But the part that I think we need to be better about is understanding the context around the action and translated that into our design when we design features and flows. And also, time is another element that can be important when it comes to health behaviors. So, when you've defined a proper, clear target behavior, you will know because it has to be specific enough, concrete enough, and it has to be measurable or observable. So some teams, depending on the UX maturity, might be pretty good at this because we are always measuring UX metrics. And it will be another talk talking about engagement and retention, and that's not really tied to real health outcomes. But I'll leave that out for today. And just every time your UX team or your larger multidisciplinary team is thinking about driving UX for a product, you need to make sure that you're always starting with a very specific and measurable behavior that you're going to design around. And of course, there can be multiple behaviors, and you have usually multiple user groups. When you have patients or end users, you have maybe the healthcare providers, multiple different types of healthcare providers that might be involved. But any behavior that you're trying to drive, it always needs to be specific and measurable. If you can't measure or observe it, it's not specific enough. You need to get more granular. So I don't think this is rocket science, but I can't tell you how many teams I've worked with where even very senior UX people don't fully grasp this concept and don't apply it. And here's a perfect example of why not. These are not target behaviors, and I know a lot of us are very used to speaking in this language. We're always just trying to improve the user experience. We want to make the app more user friendly, or drive patient engagement, or boost treatment adherence or medication adherence. And these are great goals to have, and they might be good, outcomes that you might strive for, aspirations, but they're not, there's no behavior in this, right? You need the person doing an action in a context at a specific time. So even a boost medication adherence, that doesn't actually tell me who's the person, what exactly do they need to do to adhere to the medication, what's the specific action, how are we going to measure that, and anything about the context around it that might be relevant to that behavior. So I really encourage you, when you hear your teams saying these things and talking about this as your whole goal for the product or for the roadmap, whatever it is, I encourage you to step in and call people out and say, actually, let's get more specific on what exactly is the behavior within medication adherence, within patient engagement that we're trying to drive. So some examples here of how we can translate this into specific, clear, measurable behaviors. Instead of just improving the UX, what exactly does that mean? Maybe we have the user book their follow-up doctor's appointment in under 2 minutes. We're getting really specific, who the user doing what context, and what time frame as well. Instead of make it more user friendly, new users, we can be specific about a segment of users, navigate to the first task in our app in under 3 taps after onboarding. We've gotten really specific about exactly when, how this is happening, where in the app, and how long it should take. And same thing with these other examples. Patient engagement. What does patient engagement mean? We want the patient to log their symptoms in the app, at least for this time frame. How many times per week, and then what's the duration? Let's say 12 weeks. Medication adherence, they confirm they took their prescribed dose 5 out of 7 days per week. So I think it's pretty clear here. These are the kinds of things that we need to be talking about in every design meeting. Every time you do research, you should be speaking and thinking in these granular terms about the behavior that you're designing for. So how to actually apply this to your UX research. Anytime you're doing anything in the research process, you're making a research plan, you're drafting up your discussion guide or your survey or what have you, check yourself that you always are clear on the behavior that you're trying to investigate. Here, we're not designing, we're doing research. If we're talking about exploratory research, your entire discussion guide can be framed around questions that get at, do you usually know your users? Let's assume that you do. The specific behaviors, the specific actions that they're already doing related to your app and what you're trying to drive. Really understanding the context. I really encourage every UX researcher to do that exploratory research, even if it's just a few questions at the beginning of your evaluative or usability test. Ask the questions to understand the larger context, the digital context, like the other apps they're using on their phone, related behaviors when it comes to medication adherence, other medications they're taking. This might seem obvious, but I've still seen teams where we're in deep into the design process, and they're not everyone on the team is clear about the context around this one behavior that we're trying to drive. Where is it happening? How is it happening? How frequently? Is it per day, per week, etc.? And yeah, when the action is actually occurring, especially in your flows as well. When does it actually occur in the app itself? If you can say you can define all these 4 things for everything in your current product roadmap, that's great. If you can't, go back and do this exercise. And again, like I said, for any behavior you're trying to drive, you better be able to be specific and concrete about it. And it should be something you can actually measure. And yeah, where, when, how, those are all very clear to you. For your design, I challenge you all right after this session, go review your product roadmap. Go review what you're actually going to be developing in the next 1, 2, 3 months. And I challenge you to link every planned feature or development or whatever it is you're working on to that specific measurable user behavior. And like I said, being really clear on the different user types. What's the healthcare provider doing versus the patient or the end user versus anyone else? If you can do that, great, you're doing a good job. If you don't, if you can't, you might need to reevaluate. And this can also really help you reprioritize as well, because you might find in your roadmap that some of the features you have planned are tied to actual specific behaviors that are more important than other behaviors, but they ended up on the roadmap. We all have probably had experiences where the roadmap may not be appropriately prioritized. So this can be a way to keep it in check and to get all stakeholders aligned on what the priorities are when you are first clear on what the user behavior is that you want to drive. And then when you start new design work, like I said, you need to be starting from a point of behavior. Define that target behavior before you start designing anything. Like I said, every team pretty much that I've worked on has skipped this step or kind of glossed over this step, or they talk about boosting medication adherence, which is not actually really behavior. And then we get deep into the design process and we realize, well, this feature or this flow actually, is it driving that exact way that we want to boost medication adherence? Maybe not. So yeah, review everything and get clear, get all the stakeholders in the room to agree on what that behavior is that you're going to drive before you get 3 rounds into your usability testing on a high fidelity prototype. And a lot of times we talk about this larger product goal that your team has, or the business outcome that came from the C suite or leadership, or we often talk in user needs or user stories, or even jobs to be done. Jobs to be done sounds like pretty behavior related, but oftentimes they may not be actually specific or measurable. So even jobs to be done is not necessarily behavior. So use the framework I gave to define behavior. All right, moving right along. I hope that's very clear. I'll stop hammering on that now and talk a bit about the fog behavior model. I wish I could see everyone. I would usually ask how many people are actually familiar with it. I know this is not something completely unheard of in our field, but I want to talk about it really quickly so I can then show how to actually apply it. So if you're not familiar, the fog behavior model is this really simple model to understand how any human behavior works. It's from Dr. BJ Fogg. He's at Stanford and he has the best-selling book Tiny Habits, highly recommended if you haven't read it yet. So that's what the fog behavior model is. And the main tenets of the fog behavior model is BMAP. You may have heard of this. So what comprises behavior? Like anytime you think about driving a behavior, once you've gotten clear and specific and measurable on that behavior that you're driving, these are the things you're going to have to focus on in your app, in your product, to actually make sure the behavior happens. So any behavior in the world across any human being will only occur when you have three things come together at the same time. A user needs to be sufficiently motivated to do that behavior. They need to have the ability. It needs to be something easy enough for them to do. And you need to actually prompt the behavior. And again, I think this is pretty intuitive to everyone, but when it comes to actually applying these concepts, I see time and time again that we often forget to think deeply enough about each of these three elements. So I would normally go over this whole graph here and explain it step by step, but I think for this kind of audience, the UXers here, this is pretty intuitive, so I won't go in depth, but basically what this graph is showing is that we can map motivation and ability together on the two axes because they kind of have this synergetic relationship. So if you can see here, we have motivation on the left, going from low to high. And on the bottom, we have ability, something being hard to do versus easy to do. And that green line is showing the line beyond which somebody will do a behavior. So if you look in the top left corner, when motivation is super, super high, right? If you look at that top left corner up there, you don't actually have to have something be that easy to do. You're so motivated that as long as you're prompted, you will do the behavior. And at the other extreme, if you look all the way in the bottom right corner, when something is super, super easy to do, you're going to pass that green action line if your motivation is actually fairly low because it's so easy that you don't actually have to be that motivated. You'll do it anyway. Um, so you can see prompts succeed in that top right space above that action line, and then they would fail if you don't have either sufficient motivation or ability. So that's a really sped up explanation of it, but I think it is intuitive probably for this audience. So the goal here to understand is that, and this changed the way I think about any behavior now when I'm designing, when I'm doing research. Motivation and ability compensate for one another. This is absolutely key. The easier something is to do, the less motivation someone needs. The more motivation someone has to do the behavior, the harder it can be, the less you have to focus on it being easy. However, as we all know in healthcare, especially of all things, usually things are hard to do, unnecessarily hard to do. And also, people may not be so motivated for a multitude of reasons or have many competing things going on in their life to be able to take their medication or get a certain treatment, whatever it is that the behavior is. So the other thing to understand here is that motivation, like I just said, it's constantly fluctuating. It comes in waves, right? One day we're really, really motivated to perfectly follow our treatment, and next week, the following week, motivation can wane. Things happen in life. So again, another mistake I hear so many product teams make is focusing on motivation, like really focusing too much on we just need to motivate the users, we just need to make all the benefits clear of our product or our app, we just need to hammer them on how valuable it is. Motivation is the hardest one to influence, which is why you shouldn't start off with motivation, because naturally it's always going to be waxing and waning, even if you have a super motivating app with amazing copy and amazing visuals, right? So, the second best thing to do is to work on the ability piece. Make something easier to do. I'm not going to harp on this because I know UXers of all people are very familiar with this. We really understand reducing friction, reducing cognitive load, and making things easy to do. But the thing that wasn't totally clear to me before understanding this model, and the thing that I want everybody to be doing as their number one first step to drive behavior, is the prompt piece. This is the easiest thing to influence. More than making something easy to do, definitely more than making someone motivated to do certain behaviors. You want to check your prompts and make sure that they're effective. So this brings me to a behavioral audit. Everyone here, I think, again, another skill I think every UXer needs is to be able to audit why a behavior is not working in their digital product or service. And I think we're very good at a lot of things like journey mapping and applying jobs to be done and all these different things. But we need to be thinking in terms of auditing why a behavior, a real world behavior, is not occurring. What are the pieces that are missing? So, as we just said, starting with the prompts, that's your number one step. Then, ability is number two. And finally, motivation is number three. So, what does this actually mean? When I sit down to do a behavioral audit for a client, what am I actually doing? Um, the prompts are key. So, we all know this to be whether it's a call to action, certain buttons, whatever it is in your product or service that is actually telling a user to do something right now. That's what a prompt is. So I encourage everyone go through your entire journey. If you haven't done that with journey mapping or sat down and actually used your own product, everyone here should know to do that. But if you hadn't, that's okay. Go through it, go through your Figmas, go through your designs. Anytime on a screen that you have a prompt, check, do this kind of audit, do this check. First of all, do you even have the prompts for that target behavior that you've properly defined? Are they there in the first place? Because I've even worked with clients who they want to drive a behavior and then they don't realize that they don't actually call it out on the certain screen, in the flow, on the website for the person to do that behavior, which it's never going to happen if you're not calling it out. So, are the prompts even present? Then, are they clear? Is it clearly explained exactly what's expected of the user to do, what the action is that they need to take, and the time frame as well? Are your prompts effective at driving the desired behavior? And is it timely? Sometimes we have these great prompts or notification reminders or things like that, but they're not happening at the time that the user can take action and they become completely useless. Even though that user has the high motivation and the high ability, it's easy enough for them to do that behavior. Your reminder notification is coming, at a time that they are working and they just miss it every day. So these are kind of four things that you can go through and make sure every prompt you have in your entire flow, user journey, whatever it is, has these prompts that are present, clear, driving the actual behavior you want, not a different behavior, which I've seen as well, and timely. I wanted to call out just to bring some examples into it. I really liked this example from a symptom tracker. This is the iCompanion app for multiple sclerosis. And I haven't seen this often in any other app, but basically, when in your onboarding flow in iCompanion, they are asking you when do you want to do a check in to log your symptoms. And they have four different routines, common routines that everybody tends to have. And they're prompting you to think about not just setting the reminder at a time, because at a certain time is something where, our schedules might be kind of changing a lot. There's things that we may not be able to anticipate when it comes to a time. Or if it's something for every day, your weekday time at 10 p.m. might look very different from your weekend time at 10 p.m., right? So here they instead are anchoring people to a routine. Again, if you're familiar with Fogg's work, you'll know that this is also a very good way to spark habits and get people to do repeated behaviors. So they actually have you think about what's the routine that you might be able to tie this behavior to, symptom logging, which part of the day, which routine matches you best, and then they have you pick that instead of just a random time during the day. So I think this is really effective and interesting way to do it. Then make the behavior easier to do. This one I'm not going to harp on. I know everyone here is very familiar with reducing friction, but basically, again, I encourage everyone sit down, go through your entire product, your entire journey, and see where are the friction points. Anywhere that you can reduce the cognitive load with the verbal design, with the visual design. I think a lot of these that I've mentioned here are probably not new to everyone, but just in case, audit yourself. Like, are you really appropriately chunking the information or the tasks for the user into the smallest pieces or atomic levels so that it's easier for them to understand and to take action on? Copy is a big one, and I can't tell you how many apps I see with, especially healthcare apps are the worst offenders. They have long paragraphs of copy or just, multiple dense lines of especially health related information or legal information. Uh, just break up the long paragraphs of copy into bullets, into no more than 2 to 3 lines. Use concise phrasing. Again, healthcare and regulatory, these are the worst offenders of saying things simply. So challenge yourself every time you design a screen, you put copy in your app, just say it in the most concise way. We have AI tools to do this now. Everyone knows how to use ChatGPT to get things to be more concise. Make sure your copy is short and concise, as simple as possible. Again, I think most UX designers understand this, and I still see them not doing this. And lastly, Hick's law, right? The more choices you have, the harder it is to pick one. So default options, I know everyone here is familiar with defaults. make sure in every flow, in every part, whether it's onboarding or your main tasks in the app, is it clear what the default option is when you have multiple options, and limit the choices per screen. And I actually want to go through an example really quickly of an audit that I was just doing on my own for a symptom logging app so we can see this in action. And one last thing here about ability. Um, and once again, I think it's intuitive, but we forget this a lot. What we think the effort is for the user is not necessarily what the user perceives. The user might perceive really high effort when they read a paragraph that's more than 3 lines, even though the rest of your screen is blank. That might be enough of a high mental effort to have somebody abandon or churn or stop logging their symptoms. So, really, this is where UX research and UXers come in, right? It's our job to understand the difference sometimes between what our team thinks the effort is in this flow on this screen with this copy versus what that perception might be for the user. And this is why it's so important to use the really short, concise copy, short flows, progressive disclosure, right? Are you breaking things up, chunking it across screens? Because all of that creates that cognitive load for the user, and they might perceive more effort than you think. And really quickly now, I'm going to go through live here, like my thinking when I do a behavioral audit. I just picked the one of the most rated apps in the App Store for symptom logging. And basically, what we have is once I download the app, the first thing I see is what should we call you? I really like this. When it comes to personalization, that's really important in healthcare and making things feel like they are for you. There's studies out there, and I can cite them for anyone who's interested about using the word you in healthcare can be the difference between, making something that people are actually engaged with or not. Vaccine uptake, there's studies on how a vaccine reserved for you drove much more receiving that vaccine than just get your vaccine. So, what should we call you? They're asking you what your name is so that they make it feel like they're talking to you personally. We're glad you're here, Amelia. Again, really welcoming. And then one of the ways I really like how they've reduced cognitive load and reduced friction is this app. The whole idea is that they are having you log your moods and things related to health without having to write a single word. All of it is through emojis. So they call it out right here on the second screen. You're going to capture your moods without any writing. And for me as a user, that is very appealing because we know users they don't have time to be reading and writing a lot. So I think this is very motivating, and they've done a really good job of reducing that friction and that cognitive load right from the beginning. Create your personal mood palette. Again, they're doing a really good job of personalizing this. Maybe some people don't care about personalizing their color palette and which emojis they're using, but maybe some do. And again, it just creates this, if you've heard of the endowment effect, that's why personalization is so effective, because once we feel like something is ours and we own it, we're more likely to value it, and therefore that leads to better engagement and retention. So I like this, even though I thought I wasn't actually interested, and when I was going through and I picked the emoji that I liked, I even felt a bit of that delight. Even though this is not even an app I'm using for myself, I was just doing a behavioral audit. So these are small things that can be really effective. And then, what would you like to keep an eye on? So they're really personalizing this experience to me. They have a bunch of different categories here, and I can pick what are the health categories that I want to be putting in my diary every day: emotions, sleep, health. They had a list, it wasn't too long, but also, like we said, when there's a lot of different choices, making sure you're calling out what the default is, or what are the few suggestions that somebody can start with, reducing that cognitive load. Even this copy right here is helping to reduce the cognitive load for me, because it might be really overwhelming for me to think, I don't know, my health is so complicated, there's so many categories. Here are just a few suggestions that we have of the most popular categories. However, we're getting now to the part where I think there's room for improvement. Encourage consistency with reminders, which is not a bad thing, right? They know that habit is a powerful ally in emotional mindfulness. Schedule your reminders. Many apps have this, and it's not necessarily inherently bad, but I would argue that when you are, first of all, like I said, tying something to a routine, especially if it's going to be a repeated behavior, could be really much more effective than a time. But also, I would argue that this is not well timed. This prompt here is not well timed because we're doing the onboarding, and I don't actually have any real concept of the how much time or effort it takes to log my symptoms or log my mood in your app. So it can be hard for me to pick a time when I don't actually know how long it's going to take. Will it take 5 minutes, which actually is a long time for a user? Will it take 1 minute or 2 minutes? Maybe that changes what time I want. So I would argue first have the user do their first check in, their first diary entry, so they can see how much effort it takes. And then that's when you want to prompt them to set the reminders. Um, then really simple emojis here. I really love this. I love that there's no writing. How are you? Just pick one of these faces and you're done. It's also playful, um, has a bit of that delight feel. So that's great. But then I was so disappointed when I got to the diary. I really had high expectations here for this app. And then I felt that this screen to actually do your diary entry was pretty overwhelming. There's a lot of different options here. It's not progressively disclosed, right? We could easily just have emotions on one screen, then the sleep on the next, then health, but it was all in one single screen, and it actually started to feel a bit burdensome for me to pick those options. Then down here, after our health and sleep, there's options for a quick note to add a photo and a voice memo. And again, there's no default option actually clarified here. I don't know what is expected of me at this step. Do I have to just do, like we saw, the emotions and the sleep? Because that's what I said I was interested in. Those are the boxes I checked. Do I have to add a note? It doesn't say if it's optional or not. Again, photo, same thing. I don't actually know. Do I have to put a photo? They're not making it as easy as possible to do the minimum behavior and then clarifying that's the default. Here's more if you want to add it. And this can really be the difference between drop off versus someone successfully completing. And then, very last step here, you had to actually scroll all the way down to then save your log. And like I said, I think people should be given the option to save the log when they've just picked the emojis, especially because the app was already promising that this is emoji based, right? You don't have to do any writing. So why does it say a quick note here and then it's not clear that it's optional and it's not clear that the default option was only to pick my emojis and I'm done. That save button should be higher. You should be confirming that you've done the minimum required and you're good to go. But instead, that save button is all the way down there, and it's not clear that these are not the default options to add the voice memo and the photo and the quick note. So I think this is the top rated. I think this has like 53,000, 4 point something stars on the App Store. And yet, there are things that even the top apps can be doing much better to reduce that cognitive load. And probably, I would argue, I put money on it that engagement would increase, and maybe people would not drop off as much or churn after onboarding if they made some changes to this onboarding flow. And then lastly, they have this nice congratulations, but I thought this was weird. Like the prophecy talked about you, Delio Apprentice. I think this is a good opportunity here to tie this messaging to their goals, to their motivations, why they're in the app in the first place. Congratulations, you just took your first step to whatever it is. So I thought that this could be improved as well. And that's it. Last disclaimer here, I think I've said a lot of things. With behavior design, with behavioral science, you don't just apply the principles blindly. Don't just remove friction everywhere, right? Sometimes friction is good and important. And there's no silver bullet for changing behavior. It's not like you can just reduce friction and magically everybody's going to do the behavior. You constantly have to test and iterate these solutions. But hopefully, for a UX audience, this is something that we all understand here. And that's it. I have a too long didn't read page. This is my, executive summary. If there's anything I want everybody here to know, get clear on that target behavior, think about motivation, ability, and a prompt. And then when you do that audit, like really I encourage you, go through, do an audit of your prompts of are you making the behavior as easy as possible to do with the flows, with the copy, with the visuals, with default options, and yeah, then you are doing behavior design much better than some of the UXers I've worked with in the past. So that's it. I have a few resources here. I know people probably they can't click on this. This is just a visual, but please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm about to give you my LinkedIn, and I'm happy to share these resources that I've curated over the years from being in the space. Some of the organizations that I think do a really good job of making behavioral science knowledge accessible and actionable. And I wouldn't be a good behavior designer if I didn't make it really easy and seamless for people to add me on LinkedIn. So I didn't just put a link that you cannot click on, but I have a QR code here. I'm hoping that works. I didn't test it. That was a bad behavior design move, but let's hope it works. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll be posting a lot more, and I'm actually in the middle of creating some tools for people, non behavioral design trained people to implement behavior design in their UX work. So please follow me, stay tuned for more of that, and reach out to me. I work with digital health companies and product teams, and I do behavior led UX. So if you want help doing that on anything that you've seen here today, just reach out and let's chat. And that's it.
Awesome.
I
Thank
could
you,
find,
Amelia. Really appreciate it.
thank you.